You were taught that stability is the goal. A life that avoids risk feels responsible and mature. It sounds like the safest long-term strategy. A fixed salary creates predictable income over time. Your expenses become structured around that certainty. It feels like you are managing volatility well. Everything starts to look organized on the surface. There is less visible risk in your daily decisions, but your time horizon quietly becomes narrower. Then something small shifts in your environment. A cost increases or income slows down. Suddenly, the system shows signs of fragility and drawdown. This is the part rarely explained in simple terms. Stability can reduce short-term stress but increase long-term risk. What feels safe today may limit your ability to adapt tomorrow. Stability feels simple. It reduces complexity into something predictable, and that predictability lowers perceived risk over time. You know what comes in, you know what goes out. Your time horizon feels manageable because nothing seems to shift. That creates a sense of safety, or at least the illusion of low volatility. It feels stable, even if nothing is guaranteed long-term. The system works as long as nothing changes. It depends on stable inputs and predictable outcomes. But that assumption quietly carries hidden risk. Modern systems are not static. They are built on constant movement and adjustment. Volatility is not an exception, it is the baseline. Prices increase over time, jobs evolve or disappear, and your financial position shifts, whether you notice or not. A system designed for stability struggles with change. It lacks flexibility under pressure, and small shifts can create large drawdowns over time. Stability is not a mistake. It simply was not designed for constant change, and that mismatch becomes clearer over the long term. Take a closer look at stability. The more stable your life becomes, the more fixed it gets. And fixed systems tend to reduce flexibility over time. Contracts begin to define your time horizon. Debt locks in future income before it arrives. Long-term commitments reduce your ability to pivot. Everything starts to look organized on the surface. But underneath, the system becomes harder to move. What looks clean can also become heavy. The real risk is not uncertainty. It is rigidity in a changing system. Low flexibility increases exposure to volatility. When change arrives, adaptability becomes the advantage. Flexible systems absorb shocks better over time. Rigid structures tend to face sharper drawdowns. Pressure rarely appears all at once. It builds slowly in the background. Over time, small constraints compound into visible stress. It is not that you made a wrong decision. The system itself shifted over time, and your structure could not adjust fast enough. This is not a personal failure. It is a mismatch between old design and new reality, and mismatches create long-term friction. Stability used to make sense in a slower system. Change moved gradually, giving people time to adjust. Risk felt visible and somewhat manageable over a longer time horizon. Now the pace is different. Changes arrive faster and with more volatility. The system shifts before most people can react. But our thinking has not updated. We still optimize for stability as if conditions are unchanged. The strategy stayed the same while the environment did not. We avoid change because it feels like risk. We avoid risk because it feels like loss. And we avoid uncertainty because it feels uncomfortable. But this avoidance creates a different kind of risk. It reduces your ability to respond to volatility. And that is where real fragility starts to form. Flexibility is not built by routine alone. Buffer is not created by fixed income streams. And options do not appear without intentional design. Instead, we build routines that feel efficient. They work well under stable conditions, but they depend on the absence of disruption. And that is the problem now. Disruption is no longer rare or occasional. It has become part of the system itself. Stability is not the problem, but when it becomes the main goal, it quietly limits your decisions. It shifts your time horizon toward preserving instead of growing. You begin choosing what feels safe: predictable income, predictable outcomes, minimal volatility. Risk slowly becomes something to avoid, not something to understand. Over time, your flexibility decreases. Fewer options remain available when conditions change. Your system becomes efficient but less adaptable. It is not about capability. You are still capable of change and growth, but now there is more at stake to protect. The more you protect, the more you fear loss. That fear reduces your tolerance for drawdown, and slowly your willingness to act gets smaller. This is not just about money. It affects how you make decisions in life. Your entire risk perception begins to shift. Stability creates comfort, but it also creates dependency over time. And dependency is difficult to unwind once it compounds. That is where the real risk appears, not because stability is wrong, but because it quietly limits your long-term optionality. What you actually need is not stability. Stability feels safe, but it often limits your response to change. What you need is flexibility across time and uncertainty. Flexibility means you can adjust without breaking. You can move when conditions shift. You can respond to volatility instead of resisting it. You stay calm even when things move fast. You do not panic when plans change. You maintain direction across uncertain time horizons. This is rarely taught because it looks messy. It does not fit clean plans or simple metrics. It feels less secure even when it is more resilient long-term. In a system defined by constant change, rigidity becomes risk. Flexibility absorbs shocks over time. It reduces long-term drawdown in uncertain environments. Flexibility gives you space to move. Stability gives your life structure. Both matter, but they serve different roles over time. The order is what most people get wrong. They build structure too early. Without flexibility, that structure becomes a constraint. Build flexibility first, then layer stability on top. That is how you survive long-term volatility. Otherwise, you end up locked into fragile systems. Wanting a safe life is not the problem. That instinct exists for a reason. The issue starts when safety becomes the only goal. The real issue is how you define safe. That definition may come from a different time, and it may no longer match today's volatility. Safe does not mean nothing changes. Safe means you can survive change, especially when the time horizon becomes uncertain. That requires a different kind of structure. Not something rigid and fixed, but something that adjusts with conditions. A system that adapts without losing balance. One that absorbs shocks without panic, that reduces the impact of drawdown. This does not come from strict routines alone. It comes from intentional life design, a system built with awareness over time. A design that creates space, not just for certainty, but also for possibility and compounding outcomes. Because in this system, stability is not the winner. The ones who last are those who adapt, especially in a world shaped by constant change. The systems that survive are rarely the most stable. They are the ones that can adjust without losing direction. Flexibility quietly outperforms rigidity over a long time horizon. Most people optimize for control, not adaptability. They lock their time, income, and commitments too tightly, and that increases fragility during volatility. Flexible systems leave room for mistakes. They assume change will happen over time, and they adapt without triggering a full breakdown. This kind of strength is not easy to see. It does not look impressive or dramatic, but it reduces long-term risk quietly. A flexible life does not spike quickly. It grows through steady compounding over time, and that often feels quieter but more sustainable. The goal is not to rise as fast as possible. It is to avoid deep drawdowns when things change. Stability alone does not protect you from that. Chasing stability as a goal creates hidden constraints. It reduces your ability to respond to change, and that becomes a risk over time. What actually matters is flexibility, the ability to adjust your path without panic. That is what builds resilience in the long term. Wanting safety is not the mistake. It is a very human response to uncertainty and risk. But the definition of safety you use might no longer match reality. The system you are operating in has already changed. Time cycles move faster and volatility shows up more often. What used to feel stable now has a shorter time horizon. If you keep using old assumptions, the results will feel unstable. Not because you failed, but because the inputs are outdated. That gap creates invisible risk over time. The adjustment does not need to be dramatic. It can start by creating small flexibility in your system. Reducing rigidity increases your ability to absorb change. Over time, this creates something more durable than stability. Not fixed, but adaptable under pressure and change. That is what holds through long-term uncertainty and compounding shifts.